You
Hello,
good?
everyone. Welcome to the annual program looking back at the conversations and topics and themes that were part of this year's series. So let me start by saying if you downloaded the handout, or maybe I should say when you download the handout, there will be a lot of slides, and there are way more slides than I will cover today, and that was intentional. I can't hit all of those topics, but I wanted to include those extra slides there to serve as a resource in the handout because they offer some context and additional information for each session. The goal of today's program is to provide a quick overview of what we discussed in each session, and I'll dive a little more deeply into some more than others. And I'm also going to answer some of the questions that we couldn't get to live on the air during the webcast. So my name is Jina Etienne. I am the creator and host of this series. I'm a certified diversity executive, and my work is centered on something that I call fearless inclusion, which I define as the freedom to be yourself and the courage, or I should say the ability, to create space for others to do the same. I develop workshops and facilitate conversations and programs around helping participants connect mindfulness and self-awareness, daily actions and words. The goal is to foster a collective awareness about our intention to be inclusive, where the outcome is belonging. And I shifted to this work about 10 years ago after a 21-year career in public accounting, and I bring that lived experience from public accounting to my work every day. For the past 3 years, D&I One-on-One has been a bi-weekly series, but starting next year, we're going to be going to monthly. I have guests that join me in conversations, and it's focused on a single thing. They join me as subject matter experts, or they join me to share their lived experiences, and sometimes both. So the series will be the last Friday of every month with a few exceptions. And you can see here, January's topics are already lined up. They're not yet open for registration, so keep an eye out for that. All right, let's launch, Chris, that first polling question if we could.
Yes, indeed. Poll question number one is active on your screen, folks. Which was the most popular topic this year? Make your choices now, folks, and this poll is active for 60 seconds.
So I did about 21 programs this year. There were 2 rebroadcasts, and then I had one of my guests had an emergency, so I had to quickly pivot and just do a regular webinar. But the other 21 programs, I went through every single one, and I looked at the number of registrations, the attendance rate, the evaluation scores. And when you looked at all 3 of those, there was actually a clear winner. So I'm curious what people are saying here.
Well, we have a very tight race on this one, folks. 10 more seconds on poll number one. And closing out poll one, folks, in 3, 2, and 1. Thank you for your choices so far, folks. Closing out and sharing here. So as you can see, 26% of the attendees are saying prefer not to answer, followed closely at 24% saying unlocking neurodiversity.
There you go. So if we take out the 26% that didn't answer, the number one response, unlocking neurodiversity,
That's
I
right.
can't do the percentages of 24% of 75% or something, but you get the point. And actually, I'm going to be jumping into some of those questions in that session when we get there. So let's start with the very beginning. I launch, usually at the beginning of the year, I do a year in preview. So that's not the one that I included here. I'm starting with my first guest, which was Bonnie, let me say her name right, Russick. Bonnie Russick is founder of BBR Companies and the owner of the new owner of the Accounting Move project and the Accounting Move report. This project is an initiative that focuses on the advancement of women in the accounting profession, and more recently, it's expanded to include other minority groups. And the MOVE report is used as a benchmark to measure progress. It stands for MOVE. It stands for money, opportunity, vital supports in terms of work-life balance, and then E for entrepreneurship. It's published annually, and a lot of organizations use it to measure progress. So for example, how are they doing in terms of closing the pay gap? What is their representation look like for women and minorities in leadership? What are they doing to support work-life balance and assist minorities? How do they foster inclusivity and promote entrepreneurship? So the 2023 themes, as you can see here, are permission. They call it power, which is really about changing the conversation from I'm the company, you are happy to be working here, you should be, and to the I'm happy to work here, what's the value that you're offering me, employer? And then purpose is really about holistic sustainability, and then potential is really, what is my trade-off here in terms of responsibilities and career opportunities and advancement. In March, Norma Marquez Barahona, CEO of Speak2, joined me to talk about the importance of data and data analytics around addressing pay equity, because it's not just looking at how much men versus women make, but there's really more to the analysis behind that. And this is really important because this takes it beyond compliance. With those analytics, we can create more awareness around what that equity looks like in the workplace. We can evaluate and prioritize wage data that can help us identify targets and measure the progress we're making toward those targets. We can think about talent acquisition and management, and those analytics can help us update hiring practices that can help us attract and retain more diverse talent. At the end of the day, data creates clarity, and that clarity can help boost awareness, and that awareness can help drive action, all of which result in a more inclusive workplace. And there's so much more to workplace analytics, cost control and labor controls, balancing fair compensation, financial sustainability. We did not have time to go that far. But this is certainly something I would encourage folks to spend a little bit more time looking into. All right, so this question came up. Are pay transparency requirements impacting the gender gap in pay equity? And the answer here is good news. So there are many states that are mandating that employers either provide pay scales or salary ranges in job postings, or make that information available upon request. Some states are also prohibiting employers from asking candidates about their past salary history. Those states include California, New York, Oregon, Colorado, Massachusetts, to name a few. So the short answer to this question is yes. And people are actually starting to wonder, is this working? And there are pros and cons, how well it's working, the impact it's having. That's going to honestly depend on who you talk to, because this is still fairly new as a trend, because we're not seeing it as widely adopted, but something to keep an eye on in terms of measuring pay equity going forward. So look, my next polling question, I didn't realize it was in here so soon. Let's launch that one, Chris.
Indeed, poll 2 is active, folks. Where is your organization on their DEIB journey? Make your choices now, folks, and this poll is active for 60 seconds.
So while that's open, I should let you all know, please put your questions into the Q&A. I've dropped a lot of questions into the session based on these previous programs. I will do my best to keep an eye on that. Chris has offered to help flag those questions for me.
I most definitely will, folks. You're certainly welcome.
And that's because it's hard to track everything that's happening on the background for me as I speak, but I appreciate that.
Indeed.
Well, so let's see, how much more time do I have? Oh, not enough. I was going to make another comment, but I won't.
We'll close down, folks, in 3, 2, and 1. Closing out here this time.
We can skip the results just so I can keep moving.
Keep moving. Gotcha.
There's one other question I actually want to see the results to, but we'll move past this. So the next part is Timmy, actually I should say Tamika, she goes by Timmy, Lindsay. She's president and CEO of Anchor Leadership Solutions, and she joined me in April. She's a retired Navy captain, and she served in the Navy for over 30 years. Her last role in uniform, she served as the Chief Diversity Officer for the U.S. Naval Academy. right here in Maryland. I'm pointing over here like you all will know. It's right here in Maryland, which is where I live. She's responsible for the DEI strategy for the 4,400 students and the 1,500 faculty and staff there. And there's this perception that the challenges that she would face in her role in the military are different than those that we would face in corporate America, civilian DEI practitioners. So she explained that they're more similar than we might expect. And yeah, there's some few nuanced differences. For example, for the military, part of the role or goal of DEI is for our armed forces to reflect the diversity of the population of the United States. Similar to what we're doing in corporate America, but we also know that the diversity will vary a little bit by industry. Our accounting profession isn't as diverse as we would like. So we're working towards seeing more of that representation. The other things, for example, are how do you have a cohesive unit, an effective, I'll say, fighting force? And that's going to require this sense of belonging and connectivity, DEIB for belonging. We know that diverse teams tend to make better decisions. They tend to be more creative and innovative and have more problem-solving skills, which is something that we would like to have our men and women on the field, I shouldn't say men and women, our military in the field to have those skills. She shared this picture. Let me pull this up. She shared this picture, by the way. She was really proud of it, so I wanted to share it again. And this was a picture of the 20 Black females that graduated from the Naval Academy in 2019. There were only 4 graduates in 1992. So that was great progress. She was happy to share it, so I was happy to share this picture again. Dr. Carlotta Roman, she's founder and senior business psychologist at the Collective Career Consulting I was going to say group, but that's not it, at Collective Career Consulting. She talked about the importance of leveraging change management to support strategic diversity management and embed it in the DNA of an organization. And I love the language of strategic diversity management because too often DEI is equated with things like cultural celebrations and making people feel good in terms of employee experience. Belonging and inclusiveness is an aspect of it. But it's really more than that. And it's more than HR initiatives. It's a mindset shift. It's about reimagining culture where the norms and the practices reflect the diversity of the workforce rather than just being sort of ongoing carryover norms from the old days. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but instead of it representing a sliver of the workforce, everybody. So there are a number of different things, though, to make those changes. And so mindset shifts require methodology and thoughtfulness. There's no right solution, but it's important to have a process to think intentionally about changing culture through change management. Now, she shared a lot of them. You can see them here on the screen. I like this particular one, so I thought I'd put this up here on the screen because for 2 reasons. One, so on the left side, the boxes that you see, those quadrants talk about the different dimensions that are included in an inclusive workplace. But then on the right side, you see these levels, and they represent the different layers in an organization where those dimensions need to be woven in and considered. Next is Donnie Shimamoto. Donnie's the founder and managing director of Enterprise Technologies. He's also what he calls the inspiration architect for the Center for Accounting Transformation. And we looked at the language and the presentation of data and how that can influence perceptions and decision making. And I thought that was a really interesting discussion because, in our industry, we use and rely on the word materiality. It has a very clear definition and significance. So what does that look like if we apply that concept to decision making in the DEIB space? So there were 2 things that jumped out at me in that conversation. The first one was really about granularity of data, because sometimes we provide a whole lot of detail. That can be information overload, that can be distracting, that can start sending people in a lot of different directions. On the other hand, there can be too little data. We can oversimplify the data. And when we do that, there's the risk that we mask challenges of a particular community or barriers that some employees might be facing in different groups or different trends and issues. And so granularity, important. Another concept here is how we represent this data and the language that we use when we're presenting it. So for example, when we put up a data chart or a picture or a graph, and then through the narration of that, we emphasize the positive side of that we are making progress, that this is a win, instead of maybe highlighting maybe a negative aspect. These are our challenges. This is a gap. This is a shortcoming that we need to close. That presentation or that lens can lead to different interpretations and reactions. Much like when we present financial information to clients, it can influence their business decision making. It can influence investor decisions. So it was really interesting. And in particular, I like this question because, it was Donnie sort of sharing his personal experiences where he has seen, I can't tell you how many diversity reports. He's also led some really important research. And in doing that, he's seen and compared other places where the charts and the visuals might have presented only some of the groups, even though the narrative addressed all of them. It really begged the question of whether what we show visually leads to some of the assumptions that we might make about the narrative. So it was a really interesting conversation. Let me pause a moment and look here at the Q&A. So someone asked, what does success specifically refer to in the first bullet on the Roman slide? So thank you for asking that question. Let me jump back to see what bullet you're talking about. The management. So it's just about the effectiveness of the initiatives that you are launching through your strategy. I hope that answers the question. How do you view DEI in the USA being impacted by other country cultures that aren't focusing on DEI at all? Tracy, that is a great question. I am going to hold that one until the end of general Q&A. Thank you for asking that. All right, let me jump back. Where was I? I was at Donnie. Donnie's great insights. Okay, next, after Donnie, James Degnan joined me for the, as you now know, most popular session in 2023. And he's the founder and managing director of Neurodiversity Knows. He himself is neurodiverse. And during that session, he actually shared some of his past experiences and some of his struggles. And what he really wanted to talk about and where we went in the conversation was understanding why, and understanding why it's important to understand how to better support neurodiversity in the workplace, not just in terms of addressing historical bias as it relates to neurodiversity, but also the tools and leveraging the technology that can help everyone, not just those who are neurodivergent. Like personality differences, we are all unique. Like we all have a unique thumbprint or fingerprint, if you will. And so all of those nuanced differences that make us that distinct and unique, there are differences in brain wiring, and those differences in brain wiring are what we refer to as neurodiversity. There's this really great graph, and on this graph, it talks about all of the different types of neurodiversity. So dyslexia, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, autism, and then mental health. And all of these speak to the different ways our brains are wired. And when you start looking at some of the combinations that things bring, they might bring out special skills, and I call them superpowers, depending on the combination that people have. And I like this infographic and I like this presentation because too often neurodiversity and some of these particular conditions are classified as a disability, as in it's an impairment. And while some of these might lead to, say, cognitive impairment, that is not true for all of these dimensions. And so that's why understanding neurodiversity is particularly important. Now, there were a couple questions that came in, and I was struggling to pick one in a couple of these programs, actually, and this was one of them. And there were a lot of great questions, as you can imagine, is one of the most popular sessions, and so I picked a handful. And these questions are really a reflection of a lot of the general areas and topics where the questions were coming in. So the first question, could PTSD impact neurodiversity or changes similar to a TBI? I probably should have not written it exactly. This is exactly how it was written, but TBI stands for traumatic brain injury. Now, when neurodiversity, we're talking about the different ways our brains are wired, and as a result of that, it impacts a lot of differences. If you download the handout, you'll see something that I created called the spectrum of neurodiversity. And it shows all of the different ways neurodiversity can influence us, from the way things feel from a tactile perspective, the way we hear, the way we smell, the way we think, the way we talk, the way we experience and express emotion. All of the ways our brains are wired that then influence the things that how we show up. So if that's the case, yes, PTSD can impact impact the way we process information, which means it's a form of neurodiversity, just like traumatic brain injury can be the result of or cause changes in the way our brains process information. The next one was, how does mental health play into neurodiversity? For example, does bipolar fit here? And I want to go back to that graphic because in the lower left corner, you'll see mental health, depth of thinking, expression. And I wanted to share this because under the mental health category falls a lot of other nuanced differences. Bipolar is a diagnosis that is very much something that affects the way we think, the way we feel, and so it definitely fits in the umbrella of neurodiversity. What is acquired neurodiversity? Well, our brain processes may change for a number of reasons over our lifetime. So we might not be born neurodivergent, we might be neurotypical at birth. And then over the course of our lifetime, it could be that traumatic brain injury. It could be an illness like an actual infection that impacts the brain. It can be a cognitive decline, say something like Alzheimer's. There are things that affect our brain processing, and when that changes, that's what we refer to as acquired neurodiversity versus inherent, which is something you're born with. What are some tips for working with those who are neurodiverse, who may or may not have self-identified? This is a good question, not just for neurodiversity, but did you know that depending on the data that you look at, anywhere from 70 to 90% of disabilities are invisible? So there's likely a lot of things that our colleagues might be navigating, and we have no idea. So the answers here are going to be true, not just for supporting our colleagues who are neurodiverse, but all of our colleagues in general, but specifically here, be patient. Understand, and if the more you can understand about some of these different disorders or types of neurodiversity, it might be easier to either spot them or be more patient depending on the need. Communicate clearly, be direct. Ask other people what works best for them rather than guessing or assuming, and then respect the needs and differences that they share with you. And treat everyone as an individual. I have ADHD, and I was thinking earlier today, imagine a panel discussion where you line up 10 people, we all have ADHD and we share our experiences. No one is going to be the same. So you can't take one dimension and then, apply it to everybody. So again, that's a universal answer to all of our differences. Brian Strike is a gay man in practice, a gay man in public accounting. He's a CPA, and he shared his journey with me about navigating this profession, which hasn't always been as inclusive to the LGBTQ+ community. He actually joined me in 2021 to share his story. He joined me last year to talk about why months like Pride Month are important to recognize and celebrate. And then this year, he joined me to share and talk about some of the myths of coming out. And in this particular myth, In this particular article, when we were looking at these, the number 5, I will admit, was a myth that I held. And the reality is somebody doesn't come out once and then it's done. Individuals might come out multiple times. For example, a new job, you have to come out, so to speak. You have new colleagues, you meet a new client. It's a repetitive process. It doesn't happen just once, which can lead to some of that emotional challenge and drain. Drew All joined me at the end of June. And what we talked about there was basically it was about bias. He describes himself as a queer, transgender, neurodivergent, disabled Air Force veteran, and the son of an Army chaplain. Drew is a transgender male, and he shared his journey around being labeled all of those things and how it informed his self identity, and then how he started to understand more about how he puts other people in boxes, if you will, and classifies people. It's called stereotyping. And he's trying to do a better job, as we all are, to not continue to do that and to look at people and accept them as they are without the biases. Hard to do, good to try. He did walk through this model during the session, and it's really around understanding the cycle that can happen where you have a negative interaction or a negative reaction to something. It then influences the way you behave, which then reinforces those reactions and can create the cycle. And the cycle could repeat to the point where you start treating everybody in a particular way because that person falls into a group and you had a negative reaction with that person, therefore that group. It was a very interesting discussion. So a lot of questions came up here. What are some examples of open-ended questions that can create psychological safety? Psychological safety is the comfort and the safety of being able to ask a question or take a risk in a group without feeling like you're going to be shamed, blamed, and so on. Like somebody might question your competence if you ask a question. So what are ways we can do that to help people stay safe and still learn more about them? So you could say something like, can you share your perspective on this? Or what supports do you need to feel more comfortable in our team? There are a lot of ways that we can ask questions so that people can share more information about themselves without them necessarily having to fight to overcome that stereotype, if you will. When you put someone in a box, it sometimes means that you are now being more sensitive to what they need from your interaction. And I think that that is really well intentioned. The challenge here is that when you put somebody in a box, this actually also gets to the last question, which is around the negative connotation. Aren't we trying to be more kind and thoughtful? And the reality here is that when we say putting somebody in a box, it really speaks to stereotyping and labeling and prejudging people. And so that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is be more intentional and being more mindful so that we don't give people this impression that we're either patronizing or the opposite would be overcompensating for what we perceive to be maybe a deficit or a difficulty on the part of the other person. In July, Montrese Payton Hardy, she joined me. She was diagnosed as legally blind in 2019, and she started to notice after that how it affected some of her experiences at work. And she shared those experiences as well as some tips for supporting our colleagues who have visual impairments. I want to show you something that I did. Back in the beginning of this year, as I came to understand some of these visual impairments, I redesigned my PowerPoint slide deck. Now I want you to watch because what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip to the old version of this slide. Now, flip back and go back. So you can see how the darker image, darker background with whiter text, it pops more, it's easier on the eyes. This is an example of how we can make small changes that can support our colleagues who have a visual impairment. But this isn't just work and help them, it helps all of us. The eye strain goes down significantly. So that's just something to think about. As we work, how can we accommodate and create more accessibility for our colleagues with a number of differences? This question came in. I have a colleague who uses a cane, and I have questions. I want to understand, but I'm not sure if and how to approach. I love this question again, very thoughtful, and it has universal application. This is going to be true no matter the difference that you're trying to understand. Approach with respect. So you want to make sure that it's coming from a place of wanting to understand and not just about curiosity. Curiosity is good, but it could come off as labeling somebody in a not so positive way. Ask open-ended questions like, I'd like to understand a little bit better to ensure I'm supporting you. Is there anything I need to know to be of assistance? And respect privacy. Be mindful of any boundaries that they put up. Let them guide the conversation. July 28th, Sebastian's birthday, my son's birthday, Jess Nava joined me, and she's a self-described middle-aged white woman. And what I thought was interesting when I met Jess is that she felt, because of that category that she put herself in, she didn't always feel like she had permission to use her voice and engage in the DEI conversation. A lot of people think, just because of the things we've seen in the news and headlines, that chief diversity officers and the people who lead DEI in organizations are female and people of color, like that's the majority. But the data tells us otherwise. Most chief diversity officers are white, 76%, and male, well, okay, 46%, not quite the majority. So it makes sense that she didn't feel comfortable speaking up. And so what we talked about was the importance of having agency, confidence, and leaning into your identity to be part of the conversation. And she wanted to emphasize that by reminding us all that it's important to find and utilize little everyday moments to promote inclusivity. Leah Smiley is founder and president of the Society for Diversity, very passionate about ESG and some of the generational differences and the impact of those generational differences on the way businesses might want to approach and engage ESG and embed it in, and why it's important to embed it in their DEI efforts. Now, here's what's interesting about this. So I wanted to put this up here so you can see the definition. Older generations might see ESG criteria more along financial metrics. Millennials see ESG as not a set of criteria, but core values that speak to business responsibilities. Gen Z, it's an integral part of their identity. So they expect businesses to be engaged in social and environmental issues. And the reason it's important to understand this is that generational diversity, that's just one lens, one dimension of difference. But it's a great example of why understanding these differences is important to embed not only into your DEI work, but overall in the way your business communicates, your organizational brand, and your employer brand. Because this will become, these differences as they become more stark, can be what makes your organization stand out in a crowd of potential employers. Kimberly Stephen Tate is the owner of Tate of Mind Consulting, and we talked about looking at employee resource groups as more than just a tool to build retention and keep employees, make them happy, if you will. And so how can organizations think about leveraging them as that diversity lens that they can see more, a lens of diversity across their organization in a number of different ways. So she provided this list about the different ways we can look at employee resource groups. Sure, there's stuff about engagement and retention, but there's also understanding your diverse company needs or identifying new and innovative processes to support and grow and expand into different markets to really come to understand the impact of policies and practices. So there is a lot here that organizations can be using and leveraging employee resource groups beyond employee engagement. All right, let's go ahead and launch this third polling question, Chris.
Poll 3 is active, folks. What acronym does your organization use?
I wanted to ask this one. I thought this was really curious because this comes up all the time when I'm doing training. I never quite know what acronym to start with, so I have to ask the client. And I'll give you all a hint. There's no technically right answer here, but I'm curious because they are constantly changing. So DEI is getting most of the answers. A lot of people are actually saying something else, which I'd be curious if you dropped into the questions box what that something else is and what it stands for. So I'm going to start telling you the answer to the question, Chris. Once you can close it and then share the answers.
Sure thing, folks. We'll close out in 3, 2, and 1. Closing out here, and in this case, Jina, 41% are saying DEI.
Right.
Is what they call it.
And I like the 6% DIEA or something similar. The A either stands for accommodation or accessibility. A lot of organizations are using J for justice in there. DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion, almost exclusively. Those are the terms that are used. And then there are combinations like IND, EDI, IDEA. There are just so many. I was just curious. So I see DEI, DEI. Somebody is using justice, equity, and anti-oppression. So JEAO. That one is new for me. So thank you for sharing that. So many acronyms. No wrong acronym. It's just what are the terms your organization is using? Knowing them and understanding them and acknowledging them. Reinforcing them. All right, September 8th, my mother's birthday. Adriana joined me. She has a really big birthmark on her face. And so what we talked about is when you see somebody and there's a difference and it's visual and you notice it, how does that influence our behavior? So a lot of this conversation did talk about biases, but biases like the beauty bias or the height bias or biases that are more visual. And how does that unconscious bias then influence decision making? You know, it's the same conversation we have about unconscious bias all the time. But in this case, she was being very specific about these types of visual differences, because a lot of times we notice them, but we don't notice we're noticing them. So it was a really interesting discussion. During that session, she did walk us briefly through this intercultural development continuum. And I just wanted to reinforce that here, because what I like about this is it moves us from I'm not really aware of anything beyond my identity, my background, my experience, to the point where I'm not necessarily noticing or valuing the differences. And we move all the way along the spectrum to not only do I see, value, respect, appreciate these differences, but all of these differences together collectively inform our culture. So this is a great continuum. Stephen Sloan, he's the author of Humane Leadership, and he's the lead researcher at the Humane Leadership Institute. And his passion is about helping people become better and more human leaders. And so what he talks about is an approach where we really think about leading ourselves before we can lead others. He had this infographic on here, and I really like this because so often in this work, we talk about the difference between intention and impact. And what Stephen does is he really hones in on this in terms of self-leadership. This is about aligning my intentions with my goal and my values, being self-aware, and consciously directing our behavior so that it aligns with what we intend to achieve and what we stand for. In other words, it's making sure that what we do matches what we plan to do and what we believe in. Okay, now let's talk about credentials. Dr. Lee joined us. Dr. Lee is he leads education and credentialing for the Institute for Diversity Certification. And in this industry that we work in, I am a CPA. We all appreciate and understand the importance of credentialing in the accounting profession. This is true for a lot and many professional services. Consulting across a lot of different industries is no different. DEI is no different. Credentials offer assurance that the person has the background and the understanding to do the work, that they have credibility, professional standards apply, that they are continuously learning. Look, here's the full list of the areas or categories that are impacted by and that are influenced by diversity and inclusion. So they're strategy, and operations, as well as people, process, and community. In other words, DEI impacts all aspects of the business. And too often, people were tapped on the shoulder to lead DEI in their organization. It was an add on, say, to an HR role, or in some cases, the person who was tapped on the shoulder is a minority. And the thinking there is that by virtue of their identity, they have the knowledge to help educate and build awareness in the organization. And while well intentioned, it doesn't mean we have all the skills to do the work in these categories. October 20, I loved this conversation with Jennifer Surrett. She's the founder and director of Disruptive Inclusion. I met her at the Forum for Workplace Inclusion at the beginning of the year. She did a presentation on universal design, which is an architectural concept. And it looks at creating environments that are accessible and usable by everyone, regardless of age, size, ability, etc. And I was really excited. I learned so much. Her session really opened my eyes to see equity that wasn't distracted by the emotion often associated with equity. So I really appreciated that. And let me show you this picture she shared during the session. I thought was a really good illustration of it. Now, this is the Living and Learning Residence Hall at Gallaudet University. Gallaudet, here in Washington, D.C., is a school designed to accommodate and support students that are deaf and hearing impaired. And so a couple of things she wanted us to notice here. She said, notice that blue background on the wall. And that color was intentional because any skin tone can be seen in front of that color. The hallway is very wide. This allows for people to talk and walk. Sign language has big gestures and movements in some cases. So people can talk together as they walk, and the hallway allows for that. The walls are low, and so this allows people to communicate over the walls. And Gallaudet is very intentional about their design. They think about things like lighting, sign of light, sight of light, walkways and doorways, things like the surfaces where different surfaces signal that you are moving into different places to help with navigation, or visual things like fire alarms. All of these things are things that any one of us, regardless of a hearing impairment or not, can find useful. And that's the point of universal design. So she walked us through that, looked at the 7 principles of universal design, and gave us very explicit examples of what that means, translated not from an architectural concept, but into DEI application. So that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that conversation. Shouldn't say that I enjoyed all the conversations. Pat joined me, this was 4 weeks ago, and she joined me to talk about hearing loss. So Pat started to lose her hearing. Did I make a note here? I didn't, but I should have. She started to lose her hearing at, I think it was in her early 20s. Today, she wears a cochlear implant. And so in her work, she supports people with hearing loss. She also supports people to help them communicate with people with hearing loss. Up here it is, my notes. She started losing her hearing at 19 and wears bilateral cochlear implants. And one of the things she shared with us is in terms of being the person with the hearing disability or challenge, the hearing impairment, I should say, there are a number of challenges that they experience, things that she shared that they want you to know that they won't necessarily tell you. And as I was looking at this list, so many of these things are things that we can relate to, and we don't have to have a hearing impairment to relate to it. It just shows up for us in different ways. For example, mishearing. My son can be standing right next to me, and sometimes I struggle to hear him, and I've come to think it's his tone of voice, because when he raises his voice a little bit or lowers it a little bit, I can hear him a little bit better. And I don't think I have a hearing impairment, but again, I haven't been tested, and a lot of us do lose our hearing as we get older, which I thought was interesting. What about being left out of a conversation? Think about this from the person who maybe English isn't their first language, it's their second language. So a colleague might choose to exclude this person because they're uncomfortable with their accent. They struggle to understand the accent. So we can avoid that problem by not inviting that colleague. Or the flip of that. What about the person who English is not their first language? And so they choose to remain secluded. They almost isolate themselves because of the anxiety of what they perceive to be the pressure to speak good English, I will say, in quotation marks. We all can understand what that feels like. The difference here is imagine that you had to do this all day, all the time, that auditory fatigue is the equivalent of me having to sit on a Zoom all day. It gets exhausting to have to stare at this screen. I'm like staring now on purpose. Stare at the screen and pay that level of focused attention. Our brains are not designed to do that. It gets tiring. And think about the colleague who might be struggling with a hearing impairment and they're undercover because you don't know. Remember what I said earlier about invisible disabilities, and they cover a number of different categories. This is yet another one. I wanted to share this picture. Pat provided a number of different cartoons and visual aids for her session. I just thought this was funny, and she really liked this one because the painting is of St. George standing over a wagon, but it was supposed to be St. George and the dragon. And comics can be funny, but what they do is reveal something that is a very real challenge for hearing loss, not just because of the miscommunication, but the embarrassment that can be the result of that. Now, I wanted to share this question because I thought it was really thoughtful. I know sometimes we can feel conspicuous around somebody that has a visible difference, a visible disability. Well, the difference doesn't have to be a disability, but the example that I first thought of when I was thinking about this and preparing was, let's say I'm at a networking event and I meet somebody who's in a wheelchair. And I can tell you this has been a moment that I've had. Do I grab a chair and sit down next to them? Is it okay to stay standing? Should I step back so I don't feel like I'm towering over them? And all of this is playing in my head. And so sometimes I'm not sure how to speak to them, or it distracts me from being more engaged and grounded in that conversation. So this question, when someone is wearing a hearing aid, how much can they actually hear? I'm asking because I would like to be mindful of how that I speak in front of them. So the mindful how I speak in front of them is what made me think about that feeling self-conscious or conspicuous. So here's some suggestions for this person. Speak clearly and at a moderate pace. Don't shout because this can actually distort your voice. People want to speak louder, but that doesn't always help. Face them directly and make sure your mouth isn't covered while you're talking with them, because some people might be partially reading lips. It's okay to double check that somebody's understood you, especially if it's noisy or it's complex what you're talking about. Be patient, repeat as needed, rephrase if needed, and be mindful. Okay, I'm over here doing this now, but be mindful of facial expressions, and gestures, and body language, because that can sometimes be helpful, but it could also be distracting. The best approach at the end of the day, and I said this earlier, ask what the other person needs. How can you support that other person? Let them guide the communication. And then my last session 2 weeks ago was Drew came back, and part of that first session about breaking down boxes, a lot came up there around language and terminology. And we found that some of it might have been confusing. And so let's come back and let's talk about the language of gender in particular, because we know that when we're not sure about a word, when we're uncomfortable about a word, we the conversation altogether. We don't want to misappropriate. We don't want to use the term the wrong way. We don't want to offend. And so that's what we talked about, specifically the language of gender. Now, a lot of our conversation was organized around this gender unicorn. And as a result of that conversation, we sort of led to other terms that came up over the course of the webinar, and also generated a lot of questions, which I will show you because these will be the last few questions for today's program. But before we do that, I wanted to quickly walk through this because a lot of people found it helpful, and I thought maybe framing it again can just reinforce it. So what's gender identity? This is how someone sees themselves, their internal view of themselves. Do they see themselves as male, female, neither, both, some other gender? And for some, it does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. What is gender expression? That is the way we express ourselves to the world. Clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, etc., etc. Sex assigned at birth is the sex on your birth certificate. Now, this is usually decided at birth visually, based on genitalia. Also, hormones and chromosomes can be used. Genitalia is not always clear. And that is a question that came up quite a bit. Don't worry, I'll answer it in a moment. And then there's attraction. Sexual attraction here is really about physical intimacy, sexual activity with somebody. It's often driven by physical or some aesthetic appeal. Romantic or emotional attraction is really about a deeper connection, wanting to be close to somebody on a personal or an emotional level. Sometimes this is based on connections around personality, values, and emotional capability. So what were the questions that came up here? What does LGBTQ plus stand for? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning. And then you can add A to the end of it. Sometimes you've seen that, which is asexual. And sometimes you see I, which is intersex, which would be LGBTQIA+. And plus represents all of those other identities that aren't included there. Okay, the situation where the newborn baby's sex organs are not clear, how often does that happen? Maybe 1 in 2,000 births. I say that because it's a lot more often than we think. And it's just because a baby's genitalia and sex organs may just appear different than what we automatically expect. Like everything, there is a spectrum. I thought gender meant anatomy. Are you interchanging gender identity with gender? This was a great question because gender refers to those societal roles and behaviors that we use. And in our society, it's generally binary, male, female. Identity is how I see myself reflected in those genders, or how those genders are reflected from me. So related, not interchangeable terms, gender, gender identity. And then the last question was, I feel like all of this terminology is too much to expect people. It's overwhelming. That is common, and that's to be expected. New terms are challenging, especially when it comes to the language of gender, for a number of reasons. The key here is understanding and respecting those diverse experiences, identities, and backgrounds so that we can talk about them with respect. It doesn't mean I agree, it doesn't mean I acknowledge, but it means I can use that word eloquently and correctly. All right, Chris, let's open that fourth polling question as we wrap up today.
Poll 4 is live on your screen, folks. Make your choices now, and this poll is active for 60 seconds. Be sure to press submit after you've made your selection, folks.
All right, and somehow I missed a couple of these questions came in. While that's open, I want to go back to Tracy's question. How do you view DEI in the US being impacted by other countries that aren't focusing on DEI at all? I would say that we call it quote unquote DEI, but there is a lot more conversation around what we can, what we can't say, awareness about these identities. That awareness doesn't always result in equal treatment or equity, but we are starting to see those conversations. And as a result, in the United States, that awareness is helping us, especially for organizations that are international and global. So I do see a connection between the two, but they aren't running parallel, or the work isn't identical in both. So Tracy, I hope that answered your question. We don't have to share the poll results, Chris. You can just
awesome. That's fair enough. I'll close out in 3, 2, and 1, and back over to you.
There's one last question. Gender, the societal construct. Wait. Any thoughts about the direction of DEI in 2024 with legislation targeting such programs and as discriminatory? Amber, we need to have a whole session on that. The thing about DEI is this work has been around for 40 years. It just goes by different names. And so that's what's important to remember here is the work of creating spaces where everybody feels comfortable, where everything is equitable. That's not going to change. I think what's going to change is what we call it. Now, I'm going to take this last moment for a little bit of promotion. Next week, my last webinar of the year, the 100% team registration is open. I'm going to be talking about the dynamics of how do we optimize performance, increase connection, and foster that psychological safety so people can truly bring their best to work and not feel this need to hold back or cover up or pretend. And that brings us to the end of today. I told you I was going to go fast. I hope you downloaded that handout because there's a lot more in terms of slide content than I could possibly cover. And of course, if you have questions or comments or just I didn't go through something and you would like to ask more, my contact information in here, and I welcome you to reach out at any time.